And your slides are, the slides that you sent me are linked in the Google site for week 4.
Okay,
Okay, so they're there if folks want to go back to them or
good.
look along or whatever.
Let's see. Here we go. I have it. All right. Can people see that?
Yes.
Yep.
Yay. Okay, I'm going to talk about how to flip your class. Um, so basically, there's like flipping your classroom is a really simple concept. The idea is that you take your content and all your content delivery happens at home for homework. So that would mean like whatever your lesson would be, whatever you want to actually teach the kids. So in history, you know, it's usually the narrative, the story, sometimes the documents, sometimes it's, you know, kind of whatever I would quote unquote lecture on. I came to ODA after spending 7 years as a college professor. So I had no idea really how to teach, and I was very comfortable lecturing. And so Michelle Timothy actually suggested this to me and was like, hey, why don't you get a book on this and think about, you know, how to flip your class? Because one of the problems I was having was like, especially with the AP curriculum, how do I get all that content in such a short kind of period of time? And then, you know, and how do I also maximize the time that I actually have with the students face to face? Because there's, you know, if I'm just up there talking, it just, then I'm not really learning about them. I don't really get to hear from them as much, you know, and so this worked out really, really well. You know, so the traditional sort of way of teaching is that sage on a stage where you stand up and you lecture, right? And then you give kids homework. But in a flipped classroom, the activity happens in the class and then the content happens at home. Another way to think about it, you know, is that if you look at this, like students are preparing to participate in class before class, right? Which what they would do normally. And then during class, students are applying the concepts. So they're actually like doing work. In history, it means they're talking about the history. They're talking with each other. Maybe they're working in small groups. Maybe they're having a Harkness. And then after that, that's when they check in with you, right? And so a lot of times in my classroom, and I tell my freshmen especially are kind of like flummoxed by this. I'm like, hey, look, 90% of the time when we're in class, you're not going to hear from me. Like, I'm not going to talk. I'm going to sit there, take notes, listen to what you guys have to say. And I teach them at the beginning. I do a lot of work in the beginning on how to have a discussion and what the expectations are. But, you know, it's kind of funny for them. Like I show them a board. I said, it doesn't matter where you sit in the room because I don't really use the board. I don't use it a lot. It's not, you know, you're not going to sit there, and it's a rare day when they're actually going to take notes from me. We do that once in a while, but it's, you know, and especially my AP classroom, I think probably I use the board once. Like I just I just don't. So when you think about it, kind of like who does what, you know, at home, I'm the one I create video content online. So I have a YouTube channel and I make basically lectures with slides. They're really simple. They're not high tech at all. And I do it through Screencast-O-Matic, and then I put them up on YouTube. And so students have to see, you know, they look at that and like, that's me teaching them. And then at school, right, then we have discussions in the classroom. So it's not always sort of the exact same thing, rinse and repeat. Students at home, you know, besides watching a YouTube video, it might be reading that I assign. They also are required usually to write discussion questions. I've given discussion outlines with some of like, especially with some of like my weaker classes, I tend to kind of fall into that. But with my stronger classes, like I want them to come up with the discussion questions and kind of figure out the outline of the discussion. And then in class, I'll always kind of have my own outline and make sure that we cover the key points in the discussion that we need to cover. But usually the students are right on target and they figure it out. And so students also are encouraged to, you know, practice good study habits, make Quizlets, keep up with vocab. also things like, doing it this way, I think also kind of encourages them to be bit more autonomous with their research. And then also I think sometimes with presenting as well, because the classroom space isn't mine to present in. Like it's everyone's. So kind of, I don't know, I feel like it sort of fosters that environment. So in class, of course, students are going to discuss, they're going to ask questions. I really encourage students to share their materials. So they share their study materials like Quizits. They even share their notes. A lot of times students work together in groups to do group notes. They try to get them to brainstorm together, and we do a lot of rehearsals as well for presentations. So when we think about flipping, kind of the main reasons why it stuck with me and why I've stayed with this technique, is that we're a school of differentiated learning. We know that we have, in the exact same class, we'll have students with really, really high skill levels and then really, really low skill levels. And so when students are digesting content at home, some students will watch the video once, take notes, and be done, and they're fine, and they're ready to go. Other students will need to watch it repeated times. Some will need to slow it down. Some will need to speed it up. And the technology enables that, which is really nice. And then one of the things that I've noticed as well is a lot of students like to use the subtitles as well. And that's helpful for them. So, those are all things, if I'm just giving the lecture in class, I remember when I lectured in my last AP class, it was probably about 4 or 5 years ago. And I remember getting to the end of lecture sometimes and being like, phew, good, we finished it all, and then boom, it's the end of class and it's time to go. Why am I sitting there like rushing when I can give it to, give the content to students in a really concise way online and let them take their time with it and go through it at a time that's appropriate for them and let them set that pace. The other thing is prioritizing in class time. We have 75-minute blocks, and that is a good amount of time, but it's not if I eat it all up. If I'm the one talking the entire time in the class, they're not really learning a lot. You learn best when you're discussing, when you're teaching others, when you're explaining. And so getting the students to do that, like, I really feel like that's really good, because they digest the content at home and it might not be fully digested. They're going to come in with a lot of questions. And so then they come in sort of with a framework and then all these questions, because it's not totally solidified. And then that time in class is the time to solidify what they learned. And it usually also can really give me a sense of who gets it and who understands and who doesn't understand. Whereas if I was just teaching the class, I'd sit there and go, okay, does everybody get it? Does anyone have questions? And people just might be shy about it because hey, we only have 3 minutes left, or they kind of zoned out a little bit and didn't really pay attention. And so they're not really sure if the question that they're going to ask is going to be appropriate, or if it's going to be perceived as a dumb question, right? And they're embarrassed. That kind of stuff happens all the time. Whereas if the students can actually learn at home, then they can come in and they can be really confident about the questions that they have. So those are really sort of, that's why. And I honestly feel, AP Euro especially has an insane amount of content, and I've never had a problem getting through the content of that course with this method. I'm never rushed. I'm fine. The class is fine. It works. So that's really, it makes a lot of sense. I definitely had a lot of resistance to this in my own head when I first started it. Gosh, why can't I just keep lecturing? That's what I was trained to do, but when we think about it, students really differ in their skills. And that's really kind of one of the main, I would say that's the number one reason why this works really well. The other thing is, David wants us to be kid magnets, right? Well, you can't be a kid magnet if all you do is talk at the kids. You've got to listen to them. And most of us do this really, really well, which is great. But I found that was one of my blind spots. I was talking way too much in class. And when I shut up and stopped talking and started listening, that's when I really got to understand what kind of learners my students are and become a lot more in tune to their needs. And that was awesome. That's a great result of this. The other side of it too is that, we want students to do research. We want students to, become an authority on the topics that they're studying, to trust their own intellect. They're not going to do that if they're not talking about the topic. So they've got to go through and stumble through the concepts. They've got to go through that process to gain that fluency. And eventually they will. And that really that builds a lot of confidence for them. The other side of it too is I think about, we are a college prep school. In college, there are seminar classes where students will sit around a table and discuss material. This really gets them ready for that. It's very, very much, in line with that. And then the other side of it is the hiding. If I'm talking a lot, sorry, I gotta turn my phone down. If I'm talking a lot, then it's very easy for students to hide in the classroom. But if I'm not the one talking, then that's one less voice for them to hide behind. And so, especially in getting students used to Harkness is also sort of getting used to those uncomfortable moments of silence, those awkward pauses, right? But those are often the spaces then when the students who hide are able to finally come out. So, so that's been really helpful. Nuts and bolts wise, I'm not super tech savvy, and I am very envious of a lot of other people's YouTube content that, they have great editing skills and stuff. My videos are so freaking simple. You don't even see my face. I use slides, and I just, have slides and I talk over them, and then that's the end. And I put it on YouTube. It's really simple. If you use Screencast-O-Matic, the free version requires you to keep it to 15 minutes. There's a limit, and that's actually really great. So it's not, you really can't sit there and over lecture. It forces me to be really concise and to make sure that I'm giving them exactly what they need and nothing more. The other side of it too is I've also freed myself, especially my world history classes where the content isn't as specific as it is for AP Euro, because we have a lot more freedom. We don't have the key concept outline that we have to follow. But for my world history classes, I have found that other folks have made YouTube content that's way better and way more engaging than I ever could. And so I'll use their content as the lesson, right? Oh, it's so, and then that's even easier for me. That's great, and there's a lot of really good stuff out there that, I rely on for that. And that's wonderful. So why not? So a basic, so this is for world history. This is sort of just what a basic flip lesson would look like. So this was one of my lessons on Buddhism. It was the intro to Buddhism. So they would watch a 15-minute video where I would talk about Buddhism, the history of it, where it came from, the main ideas, how it spread through India and into China. And then, right, they have a reading that also supports it, right? So they're listening first and then they're reading, right? And they're taking notes on it, right? And then they come in and they have at least 2 discussion questions. Before class, we do an SAQ before any discussion. So I'll give them 2 or 3 questions. They have to answer them. They turn them in. That gives me a sense of, when I read those, that gives me a sense of how much they actually learned on their own, right? And then I can tell a little bit of especially if I give a listening, a video and a reading, one question will be on the video, the other one will be on the reading, right? I'll be oh, okay, maybe they didn't quite get this idea from the reading, why did they have a hard time with that? So it gives me a little bit of a sense of how they're digesting that material, how well they're doing that, right? And then of course we have a Harkness and we have a discussion. And that's when a lot of the students are able to ask their questions, they get them answered, and I take notes on it, and I take notes on what they say, and then at the very end, the last 10 minutes of class, I'll sit with my students and I'll say, okay, let's talk about some of these things. And I'll say, all right, you guys brought up this question. It didn't really get answered appropriately. Like, here's a different way to think about it. Or, oh, we didn't talk about, you guys never talked about this concept. Let's talk about this now, right? And I'll make sure that we dotted all our I's and we crossed all our T's and we finished our outline and we're good to go. It does work out quite well. So that's the end. Does anybody have questions?
Yeah, I had one. I know that you mentioned that the screencast or whatever method you use limits you to like 15 minutes. What happens when your lecture is longer than that? Or do you just make it multiple parts or whatnot?
Sometimes I'll make them multiple parts.
Okay.
Yeah. And I've gotten pretty good at like writing out my notes, and I can kind of know how, like, okay, if I have this many slides and about this much text, that's going to take me, anywhere between like 11 and 15 minutes. And so, so I've gotten, there's definitely been times, like, especially when I started making the videos, where I'm like, oh goodness, I only made it halfway through. Okay, now there's going to be part 2. So, and then like when you finish with that video, it gives you an opportunity to give a title for YouTube. So if oh, I'm going to have to make part 2, then I'll just title that one part 1, right? And then, the rest of them will follow suit.
And then I have like a second kind of follow-up question to that. So while it limits you to that 15 minutes, obviously there's more like editing prep time that goes into that. About how long does it take you to kind of like get one lesson flipped ready to go for the next day? And obviously I know that varies for most people, but
it depends. If the history that I'm really familiar with, it's a lot faster. If I have to also learn the history, if it's something that's newer to me, then it takes a lot longer. And it also depends on like kind of what type of concepts like I'm going over. Like sometimes the videos, I'll put documents right in the videos. Okay. Those kind of take longer because I have to sit there and, think about, okay, what exactly do I want to share? I'll tell the student in the video, okay, pause it here and read it, right? And then okay, and then we'll, I'll ask some questions in the video and that sort of thing, and that'll get us ready for a document discussion. That can take a little bit longer sometimes. I've also gone through and made videos and then used them and found that they weren't really useful and then redone them. Because either like maybe I had too much, I used to have a lot of text on the screen. Like I used to give the students like all their notes, and like, that's just why? Well, I'm giving it away. Like why, so I've learned over the years and I've gotten better with it. I'd say probably in the very beginning when I started out, it maybe took me an hour or 2 to make one for 15-minute video. Now, honestly, I could probably knock it out in about 30 minutes, but that's if I know the content and I'm pretty familiar with what I'm making. Sure.
Ellen, what do you do with the student that comes into class and hasn't watched the video or learned the lesson?
Well, they're just not ready for class. So then we go into I have late penalties. So if they come in the next day and make up the lesson with me, then it's 10 points off. If it's the day after that, it's 20 points off. It's 10 points a day.
But like in yours, how do they participate in the discussion? So they've lost not only watching it and being late, but then they haven't participated in the discussion either.
Right. So they'll have to listen and take notes on the discussion. They usually pick up quite a bit in that, and to be honest, it's a rare day that kids will come in and they're not prepared. And most of the time they've got a fairly decent excuse for it. And, I don't penalize them a lot on it because I also, it's to me, it's homework. It's kind of, I don't grade homework very heavily. And I think they kind of figure it out over the time that if they're not ready, they're going to be kind of bored in class, and it's not worth their while to be like that. So every now and then I kind of have the chronic person who's underprepared or not prepared at all. And we usually get them on board, but yeah, it's not ideal, but it's their responsibility. They've got to come prepared to class.
The other thing I want to mention to you with that is that Screencastify is actually a Google add-on that you can add right into your tools in Google Slides, so it's really easy. Then you just click on it to do Screencastify. The other thing for doing videos, which I hadn't really thought about until last week, is Zoom itself. If you open up your Zoom window and just hit the record button and run your slides and not have anybody in there with you, it's a really fast way to make a recording that I think is kind of obvious but overlooked during the first couple months of all the crazy.
Is there an easy connection between Zoom and YouTube? Like that, I like Screencast. I actually use what's called Screencast-O-Matic. It's not Screencast
because it goes straight. You can have it go straight to YouTube, but you have to have that. You have to be sure that that's the account that you have open. And I don't know. You might run into some problems with it. I was messing around with it this weekend, and I had a problem because it has been limited from our Google Apps for Education accounts. So you might be needing to use like an external account for YouTube, because YouTube kind of changed around how to set up your channels and stuff again.
I know Ryan's not with us anymore, but we ran into that problem and he fixed it for me, but I don't know what he did.
Oh, I don't know. Well,
because there is a big issue with like YouTube for Education, and you know, if our videos were all going to like magically disappear or something, and that was going to be a problem. He did something and the problem went away, and to be honest, I don't remember what it was.
Yeah, and I don't even know if what he did would still work given the fact that they've just changed it again.
Oh, okay.
So
well, we're flexible. If we have to figure out another way to put stuff on YouTube, we figure out another way. I mean, the recording part's kind of the easy part, you know. That's not a the other side of it too is kind of fun. Like if you teach these lessons, like I never really imagined. I mean, all my YouTube channel is open to the public, and I never really thought that like a lot of people outside of ODA would find the channel. But over the years, like I had over 20,000 views this year. I was kind of big in California, and I had a teacher out there who wrote to me and was like, "Oh my God, I'm a new AP Euro teacher. Thank you so much for all the content you've put out. I'm actually assigning every single one of your videos to my students. Like they're, you know," and it's just cool. You know, it's like, oh, good. You know, like, so the stuff that you make is, you know, can be useful. It can be targeted specifically for ODA students, but it also can be really useful to other people if it's, you know, especially if it's for a course that lots of other folks are teaching. So.
Right,
and I've had some, like I learned about a historical controversy through comments on my YouTube videos, which is kind of cool. And it had to do with the relationship between the Vedic texts and Hinduism. And that was really neat. Like, you know, so the comments led me to have a better understanding of the history itself. And I thought that was great and really useful for me. And, you know, at the first I was like mad that all these people were like really angry with me. And then I was like, oh, wait a minute, you know, like, let me read more into this. And, you know, that was cool.
Very cool.
So.
Very cool.